Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. My name is Tom Fuller. I'm the new Professional Development Director with the National Association of Government Communicators. So glad that you joined us today for this webinar. And I wanted to just do a couple of housekeeping things as we get started. You do have some audio settings on your computer. Make sure that you've adjusted your volume so that it works for you and the size of the screen. If you want to submit a question, and we really encourage you to do that, there is a Q&A button on the top of your panel, top of your screen. Be sure to ask your questions. We'll take those questions throughout, and then we'll have a time period afterwards where we'll go ahead and Sarah will answer those questions. So I wanted to, first of all, talk about the webinars from NAGC. We're in a new year for our webinars. I'm a new director with the board, so we have some really exciting plans for the webinars for NAGC this year. We recently put out a survey. Any of you on the webinar today answered that survey. We sure appreciate it because it gave us a really good idea of what sort of the top 10 needs are in terms of communication around webinars. So we're going to be developing the content for those, finding speakers, and in the next few months, we're going to start having some really awesome webinars to help you with your communications at a government level. That is, of course, what NAGC is all about. We're really there to provide support, professional development, guidance, ability to network, and learn and grow as a government communicator. And this particular webinar is really exciting for me because oftentimes we don't operate in a vacuum. We have an executive who's actually there to, that often speaks for our organizations. I myself have a new director of our Oregon Department of Transportation who was just appointed last week. And so the content of this is particularly apropos for me. And I think helping our executives speak more, not even really eloquently, but clearly, and as Sarah will say, with more presence is really vital. And it's one of the ways that you as a communicator can really show your value to your executive. So with that, let me introduce Sarah Gershman. She is an executive speech coach and the president of Green Room Speakers, which is a communication consulting firm based in Washington, D.C. And she is an adjunct professor of communications at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University, where she lectures students from around the world. Sarah has coached and trained executives and staff at a variety of national organizations, companies, and federal agencies. I won't list all of them because the list is simply too long, but they include the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the U.S. Department of Justice, the General Services Administration, the U.S. Department of Commerce, U.S. Department of Treasury, and many, many more. She really combines 20 years of facilitating and teaching with a strong background in theater and performing arts. Sarah has a master's in social work from Columbia University and a master's in Judaic studies from the Jewish Theological Seminary. She received her graduate when she received her Phi Beta Kappa from Johns Hopkins University. So with that, let us welcome Sarah, and I will let you take it away.
Thank you for that fabulous introduction. It is a pleasure to be with each of you today. I want to begin our time together with a story about communication. It's a story that was told by the late writer Nora Ephron. And she tells a story about an experience she had in her high school journalism class, where the teacher gave the class an assignment. And so I want to see if each of you can do the assignment with me, with the class, right? So here's the assignment. So if you have this is a good time to take a pen and paper or take some notes if you want. The teacher said, I'm going to give you some information, and I'd like you to take that information and think of what you would write for the lead for an article for the student newspaper. Okay, is everyone ready? Here's the information. On Thursday, the entire faculty of the Beverly Hills High School will have an opportunity to take a first-time trip. They will journey first by train, then by bus. They will travel up to our state capital, Sacramento, California. There in Sacramento, they will have a chance to hear a lecture given by the world-famous anthropologist, Margaret Mead. So now the question is, given that information that I just gave to you, how would you start the article? So you may have your own thoughts of what you would do with that information. I will tell you that everybody in the class pretty much did the same thing. And you can say whether this is similar to what you would have done. They took the last thing that I said, which was Margaret Mead, and they moved it up to the front because she was the most important. So the whole bottom line up front thing, right? Margaret Mead will speak to the faculty. So he takes their assignments and right in front of them, he rips them up and tosses them away. And he says, this is your lead. On Thursday, there will be no school. So everyone in the class starts nodding and laughing, and there's this moment of recognition where they realize, okay, wait a minute, the teachers aren't there, so there's no school, right? And it's not about Margaret Mead, it's about the fact that there's no school. And so it raises a couple of interesting questions, which I want to explore together right now. One question is, what's he trying to teach them? So as you can imagine, right, he's trying to teach them to know their audience. But on some level, this is something we already know, and we were trying to do when we thought Margaret Mead should start the article. We were thinking that would be the most important thing for the audience to know. But it raises an even more powerful question, which is, why doesn't anyone get there is no school? I want you to think about that for a moment. Why doesn't anyone get there is no school? And one reason is because your mind is so busy processing all of the data that I gave you. And honestly, I didn't give you that much information, but I gave you enough to make it difficult, that there was no room or space to go outside that information and actually get to what the audience needs to know. Now, there is a term for this that I think in many ways is particularly relevant for people who are executives. The term is called the curse of knowledge. Now, this is a term that was coined in a book called Made to Stick, and they do an exercise to show what the curse of knowledge is. So we're going to do that exercise right now. They say to picture a conference room of people, and they ask the people on one side to exit, and they say to the people who are left, do you think you can knock the melody to Happy Birthday on the table and get the person who is across from you to recognize that it's Happy Birthday? So everyone says, oh yeah, no problem, I can absolutely do that. So the people come back and everyone starts knocking on the table. So I'm going to do this right now. So they knock. So what do you think happened? Turned out nobody guessed Happy Birthday. Nobody. And that's the curse of knowledge, is that when you know it's Happy Birthday, when you just happen to have that knowledge, you actually hear a melody in my knocks. You hear Happy Birthday to you. But if you don't have that knowledge, you just hear random knocks. That's the curse of knowledge. And for executives, for leaders in government, this is particularly relevant because they have so much knowledge. They have so much expertise. It was that expertise very often that got them in the position of leadership in the first place. And so when they're speaking to an outside audience, whether it be someone in their agency or maybe it's somebody who's outside government, right? It becomes very difficult to get outside that information and actually get to there is no school, to the one thing that the audience needs to know. And so our focus today is to help you help your executives overcome the curse of knowledge so that they can speak with more executive presence. So, how do we do this? How do we overcome the curse of knowledge? And the key is that whenever somebody is preparing some sort of presentation, the natural thing to start with is the topic. So if your executive is presenting to their their team or they're presenting to an outside or internal audience, right? The tendency is to start with the information that you're presenting, and you want to prioritize the information and figure out what you want to leave out. Instead of starting with the topic, start with the audience. So here's where you come in, and I want to see if everyone can do this exercise together. So I believe as a speech coach that there's no such thing as learning in a vacuum. Everything's got to be real, and it's got to be based on what you're actually doing in your professional role. So I would like you to choose right now a particular presentation. It can either be a presentation that you would have to give, and by presentation, by the way, I mean it could be something as simple as giving a quick update in a meeting or briefing your supervisor on something, right? It can be does not need to be a formal presentation. So you can either choose something that you need to do or something that your executive needs to do that you want to help them with. So either one is fine. Okay, so write down right now, who is your audience for this? Who's the audience? Okay, so take a moment to write that down. And here's a little secret about that audience. They will always listen to you with two different needs. They will have a spoken need and an unspoken need. Okay, let's define both of these. And by the way, anytime you have questions about any of this, please feel free to ask, and we will address them as we go instead of waiting till the end. So let's talk about the spoken and unspoken need. The spoken need is what the audience would tell you they want to know. So it's often things like, we want to understand better how this policy will affect us for the year, or we want to learn more about this new initiative, right? Okay, that's the spoken need. It's what they would say out loud. But they also have an unspoken need. That's the thing that they often wouldn't feel comfortable saying out loud, but it's really what's driving it. So unspoken needs are very often connected to an emotion, like a worry or a fear or a desire. So examples of unspoken needs are things like, I'm listening to you because I have to take your information and present it to someone else, and honestly, I don't want to look stupid, right? Or maybe, I'm listening to you because I want to fit in. Or honestly, I don't really want to listen to you, but I have to. And I'm really feeling like this is going to be a waste of my time, right? So those are all examples of unspoken needs. And if you can try to identify both the spoken and unspoken need, you're going to have a much better chance at actually getting to the there is no school of your presentation. So take a moment right now and write down for your audience, what do you think could be their spoken need? And then what might be their unspoken need? Just take a moment now to think about that. What could be their spoken need and what might be the unspoken need? So when I'm working with my coaching clients on this, we'll often spend a long time analyzing this because sometimes it just takes a little unpacking. But for the purpose of today, we're going to move forward. So once you have a deeper understanding of who the audience is and what their spoken and unspoken needs are, and I encourage you to pass this information on to your executives so that they can go through this process as well. Then we get to what we actually want to say and how to be present in the content that you're delivering. So if you look on your screen, you'll see the image of a starfish. And as you might know, the power that a starfish has, right, that makes it a little unusual, is that it can regenerate, it can regrow its arms. So if you cut off one of those arms, it can grow it back. The reason why a starfish can do this ends up being essential to how we're going to develop our message of the communication. So if you look in the center of that body, there's this disc, the central disc that contains all of the information the starfish needs in order to be able to grow back its arms. As long as that disc is intact, the starfish can grow back. It is the same thing with any presentation you give, any message you're delivering. As long as your central disc, which today we're going to call your core message, as long as your core message is intact, it reflects the needs of your audience, it's clear and focused on your audience, then it's much easier to grow out the arms of the presentation, and also much easier to recover and regenerate if you get thrown off course, like if someone asks a really difficult question or if just something unexpected happens. So now let's try to figure out what is the core message of your presentation. And we're going to divide this into 3 questions. You'll see a lot of things we do here are in groups of 3, because that's really the way the brain remembers things. The brain remembers things in 3s more than any other number. So let's start. First question. What do you want them to know? So you have a lot of information, and this is where the curse of knowledge really comes in, right? You have so many things you want the audience to know. What we're asking here is that you prioritize. What is the one thing that you want them to know more than anything else? So try to write that down. If you had to pick one thing, what do you want them to know? And try it if you can to avoid having it be the overall topic of the presentation, which is actually 100 things. But I'm asking you to think about is if you had to pick one piece of information, what would it be? What's the most important one? Okay, so that's the no. So take a minute now to write that down. What is the one thing you would like your audience to know from this presentation? Number 2, how do you want them to feel? So this is something we often forget, is that no matter whether you like it or not, your audience is always going to feel something after you speak. It may be, they may feel frustrated, they may feel bored, they may feel confused, right? These are things we don't want them to feel, but how do you want them to feel? People will remember how they felt much more than any information you give them. So if you have a clear emotional intent for your audience, it's going to make a big difference. So when you're talking with your executive, you ask the question, how do you want your audience to feel when they listen to you? Write that down now, one word. And remember, informed is not an emotion. Okay, so finally, what do you want them to do? So when you think about this, the action that the audience will take after the presentation, let's think of it in 2 different ways. So one is the actual action steps you want them to take. Like you want them to approve a budget, or you want them to fill out a form, or whatever those action steps are. Be very clear about that. But there's also the response to your presentation, right? So you want them to come up to you afterwards and ask a specific question. You want there to be every hand raised in the room, right? You want them to be nodding their heads vigorously. Write specifically down now, what is it exactly that you want your audience to do as a result of hearing you speak? So take a moment to write that down. What do you want your audience to do? So answering these 3 questions, this becomes your core message, and this will guide everything that comes to follow. It takes a little bit of time to do this, but in the end, it saves time because you're going to be able to leave out a lot of the information that isn't essential to both meeting the needs of your audience and to what you want them to know, to feel, and to do. Okay, so now that we have figured out our core message, let's talk for a moment about story. And no matter how data heavy your presentation is, no matter how fact heavy, no matter how complex technical the presentation you're giving, whether you're giving a budget analysis or whether you are forecasting for 2020, whatever you are doing, it is always helpful to think of the presentation in the form of a story. And keeping in mind that a story has a logical flow that makes it easier for people to connect to it and remember it. So the ability to turn your data and your complex information into a story is going to make all the difference. So let's now talk for a moment about what a good story has and how that's relevant to your executives' presentations and to yours as well. So a good story will always sound super obvious, right? But let's say it because we forget about this. A good story always has a clear beginning, middle, and end. The temptation, and this is also where the curse of knowledge comes in, the temptation often is to start at the middle. And if you don't have a beginning that sets the context, the audience gets lost right from the get-go and has a hard time catching up. So a good beginning, middle, and an end, and don't forget the end. We'll get back to that more. Okay, let's move on. A good story always has tension and redemption, right? You never have a movie or a novel where everything is great throughout. There's always some sort of a problem that needs to be resolved over the course of the presentation, over the course of the movie or the book, right? Same things for presentations. We often think that we don't need the tension in the presentation because we are taught that we should tell them what we're going to tell them, then tell them, and then tell them what you told them, right? To be very clear and specific about that. But in reality, if you tell them right up front, and then if you say what you're going to say, and then you say it, and then you say it again, it doesn't leave room for anyone to be at the edge of their seats waiting for an answer. So rather than give them the answer up front, set up the problem up front, the mission. Here's what we're here to do today. Here's what we're trying to figure out today. And leave there something for the audience to have an experience of revelation over the course of the presentation, and then redemption, actually solving the problem. So a good story always has tension and redemption. So a few reminders here. Setting the context. Before you get into even explaining the problem, you want to set the context of why we're here in the first place. What is the current situation? What's going on, right? And we forget to set the context. And as a result, the audience lacks a lens through which to hear your information. So for example, let's say I were to tell you, yesterday I ran 5 miles. Okay, I didn't set the context. I just gave you the facts. Fine, you wouldn't know where to put that in your brain. Okay, is it good news or bad news? So very often, establishing something as good news or bad news is a great way to set the context. So for example, let's say I said to you, I've got bad news for you, or I've got bad news. I have been training for a marathon for the past year, and at this point, every day I'm running 10 miles. Yesterday, I ran 5 miles. Now you know where to put that information in your brain. Versus, I've got great news for you. I broke my leg a year ago, and it has been really hard for me to run. And yesterday I ran 5 miles, okay? Same information, but setting the context makes all the difference. Include concrete detail in your story, in your presentation. So we will always remember concrete detail much more than any abstract information. And abstract information includes a lot of jargon or insider language that we take for granted, but that are meaningless to the listener. So examples of concrete detail are things like people's names or concrete statistics or numbers, or even things like colors or the way something sounded, right? Concrete detail will help the audience remember the information. And then finally, prioritize emotion. So even the most data-heavy presentation will always have that feel, right? It'll always have some sort of emotional component to it. It has to. And it may be that you want the audience to feel relieved, or you want them to feel motivated or excited. These are all different. Prioritize the emotion and bring it out in the story. It brings your data alive, and it can be put into an emotional context. So I'm just going to pause there and just make sure if anyone has any questions up to this point.
I don't see any that have come through yet. Just a reminder, you can submit questions throughout the presentation via the Q&A button.
Thank you. Okay, so let's move on. So here is a sample story arc that you can, just an example that you can use to plug in any information that you're delivering in your presentation. So you start with the before, what the world looked like before, the old reality, right? The reality before your project. And often give the problem with that reality, the challenge with the old way, why that way didn't work as well as we would have liked, right? So this is the negative piece of the story. Then here's the key moment. It's that number 3. It's the decision to move in a new direction, try something new. So if you're introducing a new policy, it's really helpful to set up beforehand what was the old policy and why that policy didn't work, and then what the goal is in the new policy, right? The decision to move in a new direction. But then you go, what is the challenge of that move? What are we up against? What's it going to take to get there? And then finally, the redemption, what the new world looks like or will look like. So what you can see in this sample story arc, and again, there's many ways to do this. This should never be formulaic. It's just an example. There's contrast. There's contrast in a number of different ways. There's contrast between before and after. There's contrast between the problem with the old way and the decision to do something new. There's contrast even between the decision to do something new and the challenges of what you're up against. So the story arc is often moving between negative and positive, which keeps the audience at the edge of their seats and lets them really absorb the full meaning of what you're trying to say. Okay, so let's move on. All right, let's talk about the beginning of your presentation. And what you have in front of you is this image of the space shuttle. And I like this image because it demonstrates 2 things at once. One is it demonstrates the power of the liftoff, right? It shows that, like, look at all that fire and smoke. There's an enormous amount of energy that is going to getting that space shuttle off the ground. But it's not like a firework, right? A firework, you could see the smoke and the light, but then it like disappears, right? The space shuttle actually now has to do its orbit. It has to actually do what it's supposed to do. So it's useless if you have all the fire and smoke if it doesn't actually accomplish what you want it to accomplish. And that's how you think of your opener. It both has to get the audience at the edge of their seats so that they're like, oh, wow, this is interesting, but also launch into the rest of the presentation. So very often you'll see somebody who may start with a joke, right? It'll be like a funny joke and everyone will laugh and they'll feel really good and that'll be great. And then they'll switch and get to like the boring part of the presentation, right? So nice they started with a joke, but it doesn't actually help the audience listen to the rest of the presentation. So try to find an opener that actually gets the audience ready to hear everything that's coming next. It's often helpful to begin with a statistic or a story, an anecdote, a challenge to the audience, something that's relevant, interesting and relevant at the same time. So that's the opener. So just to review, in your opener, you want to set the context, right? Like I did with the 5 miles. You also, the audience knows where to put it in their brain. You also want to state the purpose of what you're there to do, like state the mission. And remember, you don't necessarily have to give the answer away, but state the mission. Like we are here today to determine what is the best set of circumstances we need in order to be able to go through with this, right? State the mission. And then give the roadmap. So let's talk about the roadmap for a second. So very often when people give longer presentations, they'll have an agenda. And the agenda will maybe have 5 or 6 things on it that they seem logical to the person who created the agenda, but for the audience, it feels random. Like why these 5 things? Why is the first one first? It doesn't feel like a story. A roadmap is a logical 3-step flow there's a beginning, middle, and an end, right? And I would recommend that the roadmap have 3 steps and that there's a logical flow from one to the other. So an example of a roadmap could be something like, first, we're going to talk about how we got into this mess. Then we're going to talk about how we can get out of this mess. And finally, we're going to talk about how to prevent this mess from happening ever again. So you see that? It creates a story and it's very clear and logical. Now, for a very short presentation, I definitely don't recommend having a roadmap because it just adds to the length. And you've all been in that situation, right? Where you hear someone who's supposed to be speaking for 1 minute and then they say, well, first I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do that. And you're like, wait a minute, or you've already used up 20 seconds of your minute, right? So be careful with that. If you are giving a shorter presentation, the roadmap can actually be the presentation, right? It can just the 1, 2, 3. Okay, so that's the opener. And again, please feel free to ask questions as they come up, even if they're not about this particular topic. So take a moment right now. I want you to write down for yourself, given who your audience is, which we've done, and the know, the feel, and the do, what might be a way you could open your presentation, or you could offer your executive to possibly open their presentation, right? So how would you set the context? How would you explain the purpose of what we're here to do, and what is your roadmap? So just take a minute right now to jot down some notes about that. So the context, the purpose, and the roadmap. Okay, let's move on. All right, now the close. So this is an area that often gets lost in the shuffle. We sometimes spend a lot of time thinking about how we're going to begin because that's where we get the most nervous. And then the ending just kind of, we don't really plan so much. When in reality, this is a mistake because the thing that the audience is always going to remember is what you say first and last. So you really want to pay attention to the ending. People will often make the mistake of ending on Q&A, which is a very common thing to do, where you'll say something like, I want to speak for 20 minutes, and then, we're going to have 10 minutes for questions, right? And so then what's the problem with that? We all do this. So that you're ending on somebody else's question, right? It could be, at worst, it could be a difficult question, but even if it's not a difficult question, it's still some random question, and then the presentation just peters off. So have a purposeful ending. One thing you can do to avoid ending on Q&A is you can say, I'm going to speak for 20 minutes, then we're going to take 10 minutes for questions, then I'm just going to take a moment to close. And so what I recommend doing is this structure that I'm about to go over of the closer, do that before the Q&A, then have the Q&A, and then save something for the end, which we'll get to in a moment. So let's go over the 3 parts. So the first is restating the purpose. Right, is reminding the audience of why we're here in the first place. Like, our job today was to determine this, or we concluded today that this is the best way to move forward, right? So you do give the answer in the closer. Remind them how you got there, right? So we looked at the past, the present, and the future in order to make this conclusion. And then you save something good for the end. And we can think of that as the dessert that you have at the end of the meal, right? Think back to a really wonderful meal that you've had, and probably what you're going to be left with remembering is that incredible chocolate lava cake that came at the end, right? So save that dessert for the end. And the dessert is something memorable, a little takeaway for the audience that often connects back to the feel, back to the emotion. So it might be, I want to close with a story about, that really moved me this week, or I want to close with a memory of someone who, something someone said to me that I really want everyone to keep in mind, or something like that, that allows the audience to take away something emotional that really almost saves the best for last. So that's the closer. So now take a moment and think about your presentation and jot down, take a few seconds to jot down how could you end this presentation, right? Remember to restate the purpose, restate the roadmap, but then what might be the dessert you leave the audience with at the end? And you'll think about this more after this webinar is over, because I know we're going through this very quickly, but it helps to get started. How might you end your presentation? Or how might you advise your executive to end their presentation? Okay, let's talk about visuals. And this is an area that ends up being really challenging and often creates obstacles for the listener. So let's keep a few things in mind about visuals. Number one, sounds super obvious. They're not for you. They're not for the speaker. They are for the audience, and they're there to help your audience learn. So it's very common to want to use the visuals as an aid, as a visual aid for the speaker to keep them on track. And it's nerve-wracking to give a presentation, and so it's hard to memorize it, and so it's helpful to have the slides there to keep you on track. I would argue that if the slides don't help your audience, you don't want them to be up there. You can have a note card or something to help you keep on track. You don't have to memorize, but you shouldn't have the visuals there only to help you. If they happen to help you, okay, that's fine. But the primary purpose of them is to help your audience learn. It's to give your audience visual cues that can augment the quality of your presentation. So that leads to number 3. Remember that you are the star of your presentation, not your visuals. I'm going to repeat that. You are the star of your presentation and not your visuals, right? No matter how great they are, no matter how beautiful the charts are designed, right? It's never going to be your visuals that are going to ultimately help your audience move from point A to point B. It is going to be the connection that you make with them, right? So you are the star of your presentation. Number 4, try to help your audience avoid multitasking. Now, in reality, as you might know, there's this myth about multitasking that somehow we actually can do 2 things at once, when it has been proven scientifically that the brain is unable actually to multitask. And what's really happening is that we're just jumping from thing to thing. So picture when you're giving a presentation, the audience has to listen to you and they have to watch the visuals at the same time, right? They have to watch you talking and they watch the visuals. Very difficult to do this. So what they're going to end up doing is jumping back and forth, and they're going to miss both. They're going to miss some of what's on the screen and some of you. Now, when you have a lot of text up there, that gets even worse, right? Because suddenly it's like they have to read and absorb a lot of text, which they're probably not even going to do, but they're going to be left with this feeling of frustration of what's this text doing there? And then that's going to interfere even more with their ability to hear you. So the more you can make what you do and what's up there work together, the better it is. So the visuals should reinforce, not repeat, but reinforce exactly what you're saying, right? And also, you can use techniques to actually connect yourself to the screen. So I want to try one right now with you. So look at the screen. Imagine you are giving a PowerPoint presentation to an audience. And I want you to turn so that your right hand is touching the screen and your left hand is pointing at the audience who is seated in front of you. And you're looking at the audience while touching the screen with your right hand. So your left hand is pointing at the audience, your right hand is touching the screen. What that does is it helps the audience feel like they themselves, you and the visuals are one thing that's happening at the same time. And so it helps them feel like it's a more cohesive and consistent experience. So that's just an example. So any questions? And please, if you think of a question about a previous topic, you can obviously just write it in, even if it has nothing to do with what we're talking about at the present moment. Okay, so that's visuals. Now, let's talk about Q&A. This ends up being one of the most important and often misunderstood aspects of presenting. So there's two letters there. There's the Q and the A, right? And very often we are only focused on the A, right? Because it's this moment where we are put on the spot and there's this feeling of being tested. And we're thinking to ourselves, oh, are they going to catch me off guard? And how can I possibly hope to be able to answer that question, right? When in reality, this is the time when you show you know how to listen, right? Think about it. The Q&A is the time where the audience actually speaks for the first time. And being able to truly listen to the person that that's talking to you and show that you heard them is, I think, even more important than actually answering their question. You can make someone feel heard. So how do we do that? So one way to do that is to repeat or reframe the question. So rather than just jump to the answer, which also puts a lot of pressure on you to immediately have an answer, you first show you heard. You say, okay, so here's what I thought you asked, right? You want to know, and you reframe it, right? And when you reframe the question, remember the unspoken need. Remember the question that's behind the question. So very often people are asking a question about that seems like it just has a factual data answer, but there's really like an emotion behind the question. So if someone says, we worked really hard this year, and how come sales were still down 25%, right? So you can give the factual answer of like, okay, what is the reason why sales were down 25%? You can also get to the question which is behind the answer, which is how come we put in so much effort and that effort didn't pay off, right? You want to hear that question behind the question. If a person feels heard, that even if you don't know the right answer, they are much more likely to just feel good about the experience. And then keep in mind also that the right person should be answering the question. So if you're in a meeting and someone asks a question and you're not the right person, pass it to the right person. And also try to have one answer to the question and keep that brief. The Q&A is not an opportunity to launch into part B of the presentation. Okay, so ultimately the goal of this is to show you know how to listen. I'll also say something really quickly about combative questions, which is if you can possibly turn a subjective question into an objective one, right? So let's say the person says, like, why are we doing this policy? It seems really stupid and we're ignoring the needs of like all of our constituents. And you say something like, it sounds like you're asking a question about how do we best listen to other people's needs, right? I turned that accusation into an objective subject that now I can talk about. Okay, so that's Q&A. Please feel free to ask questions, of course, because we're in Q&A. All right, now it's time to move to delivery. And I want you to look at this chart. This is a study that was done at UCLA that measured something really specific. It measured what happens when people hear contradicting information. So let's say by contradicting information, what I mean is, let's say someone hears very good news, but they hear it in a sad voice. So let's say someone comes in the room and says, everyone in this room is going to get a 15% pay raise. Or the opposite. They hear really bad news in a very upbeat body language, right? Or upbeat tone of voice. So you hear, everybody in this room is going to get a 15% pay cut, right? What do we believe? Turns out only 7% of people believe the words. That is very low. 38% believe the voice, and 55% believe the body language. So that means that when there is a contradiction between the delivery and the content, 93% of people will trust your delivery over your content. Does not mean the words don't matter. What it means is that it is critical to match content and delivery. If you want your words to be trusted and believed and remembered, they have to match with your delivery. And we're going to talk about this, we're going to talk about body language, but we're also really going to talk about how this applies also in a virtual context when you're presenting over the phone as well. Okay, so let's get to it. Let's talk about voice. So the key with voice is contrast. The ear needs to hear meaningful contrast in your voice in order to understand the full meaning of what you're saying. So this is where the curse of knowledge can happen really rampantly, is that you will speak in a monotone and you know what the most important things are, right? You know that it's bad news, you know it's good news, but if your voice is in a monotone, that gets lost. So let's talk about how we vary the voice. So the first way is through the volume, right? Is the louds and the softs of your voice. And a key way to do this is to punch the operative word in a sentence, right? So again, you know that the most important word in the sentence is December, right? We have until December, but unless you emphasize December, the audience isn't going to hear you and they're not going to have whatever you need by December, okay? So it's punching that word. Also, varying the tempo, the pace of your voice. So if you're getting to an exciting moment in the story, you might go faster, and you contrast that with slowing down at a more reflective moment. And I highly recommend that you use silence. The ability to pause purposefully is powerful, and it brings the audience in. If I spend the whole time on this webinar just talking, filling the space with noise with no pause, it's exhausting to listen to, and you tune out. So the ability to use some silence is extremely generous to the audience. Pitch. You want to vary the highs and lows of your voice as well, and be wary of ending sentences with upspeak, meaning that you end sentences in a higher pitch so it sounds like a question. Finally, tone. Varying the emotional tones of the presentation. So remember that story arc I showed you where there was bad, the old way and the new way, right? If you have a different tone in your voice when you talk about the old way, so maybe the old way is frustrated, things just weren't working, we really could have done so much better. And then here's a new way to do things. That change in tone helps the audience actually understand that you're making a transition from negative to positive. Because the time in your presentation when the audience is most likely to lose you is actually when you make a transition. So you want to have very clear tone transitions to help them move through the presentation. So now I want to say a little bit about virtual presentations when we get to this. So the mistake, we all know that virtual conference calls, webinars, all that stuff makes communication that much more difficult, right? Because we're not in the room, you can't read body language, you don't know if anyone's actually paying attention, right? For all I know, you guys have stopped listening to this completely and you are doing something else, right? I have no idea, right? So here's the mistake though. The mistake is that we speak as though nobody's listening to us. Because we feel like no one's listening to us, we work even less hard to connect with the people in the room. So our voice sounds even more monotone, right? Instead, when you give a virtual presentation, you need to overcompensate for the fact that people are not in the room with you to make up for the gap. Right? So you want to sound even more connected. You want to use even more variety in your voice. You want to involve people even more in the conference call, right? So one strategy to do this, we have a tendency when we're speaking on a conference call to let your voice go out into the room. Like I'm doing this right now. I'm just looking around, my voice is kind of going out into the room. Instead, pick up your phone and you want to actually channel your voice into the phone, almost like a laser. And if you do that, each person who's listening to you, you will feel like I am talking directly to you as opposed to trying to talk to everyone at once, right? You can hear that difference? So that's a technique for virtual presentations. All right, let's talk about body. When you actually are in the room and you actually can be seen by people, how do you use your motion? How do you use your body language? Now, movement is a great way to connect with your audience and emphasize your content. I highly recommend speaking with your hands. I think hands raise our energy. We're meant to use our hands. And I recommend moving to emphasize content. So for example, if you're listening to someone's question, move towards them to hear their question. We already talked about visuals, and I just want to say something now about eye contact. So eye contact gets to a principle that I have about public speaking in general, which is that I actually believe that the whole notion of, and I'm putting now air quotes that you can't see, public speaking in air quotes is actually false. Now, how can I say that? I'm a public speaking coach. What am I talking about? So I believe that because we are so anxious about standing up in front of a group, and I'm going to talk at the end about where that anxiety comes from, that we try to look at everyone at once, right? That's sort of our coping mechanism. When in reality, the people in the room are listening to you not as a group, they're listening to you as individuals. And so the way that you can best connect to them is by speaking to them as individuals, and you do that through your eyes. So you look at one person per thought, and that a thought is about a clause, and then you move on to the next person. And you have a series of one-on-one conversations, which both makes you a much better speaker, but also, interestingly, makes you less nervous, because it's easier to have a series of one-on-one conversations than it is to talk to 50 people at once. And so that's something you can communicate to your executive, that when he or she is giving presentations, how to use eyes to connect with each person in the room. So I want to close now with thinking about, for a moment, why is it so difficult to have presence? And the way that I define presence is simply the ability to be fully present with the people that you're talking to. Why is it so hard when we're speaking in front of a group? Our minds are always, they're thinking about something in the past. They're thinking about a bad experience you had, or that you didn't prepare enough, or they're thinking about what the reaction's going to be from the audience. They're thinking about the future. It's really tough to be in the present moment, which is what's going to create executive presence. And in order to answer that question, I really think we need to go back in time. And if you can picture yourself way, way back in time to when we used to live in caves, and picture the caveman stepping out of that cave and feeling the sensation of all the eyes watching that person, right? Who were those eyes? We know they were predators. And the person was literally afraid of getting eaten for lunch, right? That was the fear. So as a result, we develop these coping mechanisms, the amygdala, the fight or flight response, so that we can actually get out of danger and save our life when we're in a situation where we could be eaten by a lion, right? Unfortunately for you and me, and I include myself in this, we have transferred that primal anxiety of the eyes on us onto public speaking. So when you are in front of a group, we are actually programmed to experience the audience as an attack. And we know we're not going to get eaten alive, right? We know that, right? Although I hear speakers say all the time, I'm afraid I'm going to get eaten alive, but it's an expression. But we use this overly extreme language because that's how we feel. So we know we're not going to get eaten alive, but we rationalize. We say the audience is going to judge me, they're going to ask me a really tough question, right? And as a result, we put up these walls between ourselves and the speaker. We do whatever we can to maybe not look them in the eye, or to focus on our slides, or to just be in our head, so we're not actually speaking to the people in the room, when in reality, what we need to do is connect with the people in the room. What we actually need to do up there is break down the wall. So what I want to leave you with today we've talked about a lot of things. What I want to leave you with is that the way to overcome that feeling of anxiety about being watched is to totally change the energy. Instead of thinking about what is the audience thinking of me, put yourself aside. You actually don't matter in this. And what matters is, can you help the audience? How can you help the audience? And so if you turn the energy and your attention into helping the audience rather than into what they're thinking of me, it will make you a much better speaker, and it will make you far less nervous. So right from the start, when you're planning and you start with your audience, right, in order to overcome that curse of knowledge, and you think of that core message, and then you deliver a presentation that is directed at breaking down the wall, you will be able to actually accomplish what you want to accomplish while also being far less nervous and really begin to enjoy speaking in public. Thank you very much. It has been such a pleasure to work with you today.
Thank you so much, Sarah. On behalf of NAGC, we want to thank you for your excellent presentation, and we want to thank all of you for attending. That's all for today. Have a great rest of your week. Thank you.